Hi, welcome to Sagebrush Coffee's video blog. Our last conversation, I talked about light roast coffee and kind of what Sagebrush Coffee does for light roasts. And so today I wanted to continue that train of thought and talk about medium roast coffee. When you roast coffee, you take coffee beans, you put in whatever your coffee roaster is, and you apply a ton of heat for the early part of that roast. And then as it starts to develop the roasting profile, it goes through the Maillard reaction, and in that, sugars that are inherent in the coffee bean become like caramelized, and you start to develop the flavors. If you want to learn more specifically about our roasting process and what Sagebrush does to roast coffee, we have a link to that video in the description below. But moving on to the medium roast coffee, during that process, you use the sense of smell, you use sight and sound. And a lot of the roasting process is related to the sense of sound. You want to hear during that process certain level of cracks that are coming from the bean as the outer shell starts to break down and you start to let air escape. And so you'll hear coffee roasters talk about the first crack and you'll hear them talk about the second crack. And so the outer shell of the coffee bean is going to break down, air is going to release, and that'll be your first crack. And that'll sound like popcorn popping and kind of at the similar pace to like if you're popping a bag of popcorn in the microwave. Once that completes, you start to have this space between the first and the second crack. And the second crack is when the inner shell starts to break down. And so there's some air that's still in that bean that comes when that inner shell breaks down. And so you hear popping, but it's much, much fainter and a lot faster. And so there's a very clear distinction between the first and the second crack. And what makes a light, medium, and dark roast has everything to do with where that coffee lands between or around that first and second crack. And so for Sagebrush, I actually like to roast our medium roast kind of at the midpoint between the first and second crack, which takes practice, right? Because I can't anticipate when the second crack is going to be. I have to kind of recognize this coffee has, let's call it 90 seconds between the first and second crack. And so we want to stop it in that 45-second point. And that's kind of your sense of sound in roasting the coffee. But when you're looking for a medium roast coffee, a lot of times there is an incredibly distinct aroma that comes. I describe it as almost like brown sugar. Like you can smell cooking brown sugar right there on the stove the second that you want to stop it. And so you want to pay close attention to that as well. And that will dictate a little bit on where you're landing between that first and second crack for a medium coffee. A lot of times when I'm bringing a new coffee in, I like to roast it kind of on the light side of medium. So if that first and second crack is still a 90-second split, I might say, hey, let's roast it to 20 seconds after the first crack. So we don't want to just do a first crack roast and do completely light, because I kind of want to taste a little bit of what that caramelization is happening and what's kind of developing in that bean as it goes between those two cracks, so that we can decide, one, if we're going to pick that coffee to sell, and two, if we're going to really like where that coffee is going to land as our final roast profile and whether we want to sell it as a light, medium, or dark. I feel like personally, if I taste it between that light and medium roast, I personally can gauge exactly where that coffee is going to land if you go to a dark roast. And obviously we try it a few different ways, but that's where I like to start. And so what does a medium coffee taste like? You have natural washed and honey processed coffees. We will be getting some videos out that talk about those. If you don't see that, take a look at our website. We definitely have blogs that talk about that. It's all over our website. But a natural coffee or dry processed coffee still has the cherry on the pit. Coffee is a cherry. The coffee bean is the pit of the cherry, and that still is on the pit while it's drying. And so they put it out in drying beds with all of that together. And so you get a really, really fruited cup of coffee. Generally, as a light roast, and we talked about this in the other video, a light roast, you want to put that fruit on display. If I have a natural processed coffee, but I want to roast it medium, it's usually because that fruit is okay, but I kind of want to develop some of the caramely flavor and make that fruit almost taste like dried fruit. And so you get that like dried apricot flavor. If that's really pungent in the roast, then I want to put that on display in the coffee, and that's going to be roasted a little bit more dark than a light roast natural. If you have a medium roast natural coffee, I'm probably wanting to put some of that sweetness and caramely notes into it. For a washed coffee, that's the wet process where they actually clear the fruit completely off of the pit and then dry the beans themselves on the drying beds. You get a lot more of the origin flavor. I personally love medium roast washed coffees. I think that is exactly where a washed coffee is in its wheelhouse, because a washed coffee, you get the flavor of the origin in the bean. And to be able to do that, I want to develop that roast a little bit more and be able to put more of that origin on display. In a Latin American coffee, where your origin flavors are usually more nutty, more like rich chocolate. You get some more creaminess to them. You might have some like apricot fruit tones to them. Those types of flavors, I think they develop a little bit better if you roast them a little bit longer and you start to taste the nuts in them a little bit better. By far, the coffee that's been our #1 seller for years and years has been our gold label Guatemalan coffee. And we've rotated through what farm is that, but a lot of times that coffee is a coffee that has a good caramely note, a good chocolate note, and some sweet creaminess to the cup. That specifically has to be a medium roast coffee. When I'm trying to find, next year's Guatemalan gold label, I'm looking for the most caramely coffee I can find that when it develops into that medium roast, it's just sweet and delicious. That's really kind of what a washed coffee is. If you look at Africa, the African beans that are washed, those you're going to get a lot of that complexity. You're starting to get more richness and boldness in the bean. You're not quite yet as rich and bold as a dark roast, but you start to get that naturally in the bean. That's where a medium falls. So the third processing method is a honey processed coffee, where that process, you take the skin off of the cherry, but it still has the mucilage on the bean itself. And that gets set out on the drying beds and becomes sticky and gooey, hence the name honey. And that ends up becoming a very sweet cup of coffee. I also think that medium roast is a good roast for a honey processed coffee, but it kind of varies on the coffee. The whole point of a honey roast is you want a coffee that's so sweet you don't feel like you need to put sugar in it. And so a lot of times, like we've talked about, developing that caramelization of the beans a little bit more into a medium roast coffee gets that sweetness. Caramel sweet, that's where it comes from. You want it to be more and more sweet. And so that's where a honey processed coffee is going to really taste great as a medium coffee. I'm going to eventually post a video about dark coffees. When you look at dark coffees, you start to talk more and more about the chocolate notes in the coffee. In a medium roast coffee, chocolate is still there, but you're probably not going to get that like dark, deep, rich chocolate. You're going to have a lot more of a milky, smooth chocolate flavor. And so if a coffee looks like it needs a little bit more of a rich chocolate note to it, we'll roast it darker. But if it's that smooth milk chocolate, like a Lindt chocolate, you're going to want to have a medium roast coffee. So in summary, medium roast coffee is not the color. People look at the color for the level of roast, but that's not necessarily what it is. It's really where it falls within the roasting process, because each of those processing methods that we talked about impact color as much as the roast itself. Your roast level is not necessarily color, but where it falls within the roasting process. For a medium one, that falls somewhere between the first and second crack, generally right around the middle. And that affects the flavor by giving you more taste of what the origin is. Latin American coffees are going to be more nutty, caramely, chocolatey. African coffees are going to be a lot more taking on that flavor of the origin, especially washed ones. And really, a medium roast coffee, you're going to get what a typical cup of coffee is. You're not going to taste a lot of fruit notes. You're not going to taste a lot of rich, dark, like almost roasty notes. You're going to taste what that coffee is. If you're like, oh, I just want a cup of coffee, I would hit medium roast, washed coffees, and then pick whatever origin kind of fits your fancy, or look at our photos and see some of the flavor notes that are your favorite. Thanks for watching. If you like this video or any of our other videos, go ahead and like our channel, subscribe, take a look at the videos. If you're needing a cup of coffee, head on over to sagebrushcoffee.com and pick up some of the best fresh roasted coffee on the internet. Thanks.